Welcome, I'm Denise Graves, and you're watching Opera America's Oral History Project.
Uh, so, Kevin, I start every interview, as you know, with this question. Who brought you to your first opera?
My mother. My mother brought me. She actually was performing in it. She was doing Fresquita in Carmen in Pasadena, California, in a semi-professional production. And I must have been 10 or 11. And I remember it vividly. And it was fun and interesting. And I really didn't have another opera experience until college. And at that point, I was a piano major in college, and I started, and I was doing chorus, singing in the chorus, you get, performance credits for that. And I started working with the opera workshop and, experiencing more and more opera and being around it. And the more and more I did, the more I enjoyed it, and the more fascinated I was with it.
I did not realize that your mother was a singer. So you did have some sounds of opera in your house as a kid.
Yeah, and my mother wasn't per se an opera singer. She sang in the William Hall Chorale in Los Angeles, and she was a teacher. She was an elementary and then a high school teacher. But she always sang, and she sang at church, and she sang all over the place. And she was sort of my introduction to music in general and opera in particular.
How fabulous. So I knew you were a piano major, and you shared, that you started to enjoy opera more and more as you began to experience it more. But you, as far as I know, your first real foray into opera was as stage manager. And that strikes me as some distance from being a pianist into stage management.
Yeah, well, I was interested in opera, but after graduating in 1973 from UC Santa Barbara, I went back to LA where I grew up, and with a friend and others, kicked around doing popular music and songwriting and trying to make it in that field, and for a couple of years, and that really didn't go anywhere. And so, I hitchhiked back up to UCSB because I was broke and didn't know what I was going to do next, and started a company and working my way, just trying to make a living. And among the things that I did, I started stage managing in the theater, Lottie Lehman Concert Hall, in UCSB. And I, for the opera workshop, then I started building sets. And New York City Opera would come every year. Jacques D'Amboise would come and do a residency. And so there was just a lot going on. I would run the lights. I'd sort of make up a lighting thing, and I was just one of the things. It was interesting, and there were a lot of different components to it. And then I finally got interested in opera stage direction, and in order to pursue that, I quickly learned that assistant directors don't do anything but carry coffee and don't get paid. If you're a stage manager, you actually get all the same access experiences, even more information, and you get paid, and come performance time, you actually have something to do. And I thought, well, if I'm going to get into opera, if I want to be a stage director or whatever, I'd like to say that I was absolutely committed and clear about all these things, but I just wanted to get into the field. And so I started freelance stage managing, and I did that for a couple of years, based in New York. I was the first paid stage manager at Glimmerglass Opera way back when they were performing in a junior high school auditorium. And then I found myself hired as a production stage manager at Minnesota Opera, seasonal job in 1981.
81, yeah. And I remembered that your first real opera company experience was at Glimmerglass. And that was, we all know the Alice Bush Theater right now and love that location, which opened, I guess, in the mid-late 1980s. But so you remember it back in the high school days. And was it really just kind of a basic high school experience at Glimmerglass?
Oh, absolutely. And everything was volunteer. The sets, the costumes, the staff, all the people who were backstage helping stage management were high school kids. And I remember that the big industry in Cooperstown is the teaching hospital, and most of the chorus, all volunteer, were physicians. And there was one night where some sort of disaster happened, and several of them in the middle of the show just, their buzzers, their beeped, and they went running off in the middle of Pirates of Pen. No, it was HMS Pinafore.
Oh my
And,
word!
what do you do? I mean, it was just it was all volunteer, and it was just starting to make the transition. Paul Kellogg had taken over the company maybe 2 years before, and it was just a small fledgling company. And I was thinking about this. One of the great lessons I learned there that served me the rest of my time, still probably serves me in a lot of different ways, was an experience I had when we were doing the Impresario, the Schauspieldirektor. And I was stage managing, and the two sopranos who famously, vie, over role and how top billing and all of that. Believe it or not, this is absolutely true. There was some confusion after the first performance with the curtain call, and the two of them got into a very awkward moment. But both of them had husbands there who were both singers, and came raging into the dressing room afterwards. And everybody was screaming and yelling. It was just a continuation of the opera, which was, in its own way, hilarious and ironic. And I went in, I didn't know what to do, and so I immediately took responsibility. I said, "Oh, I didn't post the call for your bow, the curtain calls." And having then immediately figured out that, hey, wow, it's no one's fault. I took the blame, diffused the situation, and that was really kind of a moment where I realized, well, first of all, this is all about working with people, and secondly, it's all about it rather than you. I mean,
Right.
don't try to come out on top all the time. Try to get done what you need to get done, and that was really a lifelong lesson. It was hilarious that it happened in that way.
It is really hilarious. And I can see that in a Marx Brothers movie somehow.
Right. Yeah.
So you went off to a full-time paying job in Minnesota, 1981. Good Lord.
It was not a full-time. It was paying. It was a seasonal job. It started in September and ended in May when the season ended. But come April, we were insolvent, and we managed to end the season, but then we were bankrupt, and everyone got laid off. And the board decided they were going to reconstitute the company and pay off the debts. In the meantime, they was suggested that I stay on along with the person who ran the education program. The education program was a separate legal affiliate. They were doing fine. I was asked to stay on because I was the production guy. And so at that point, I was offered my first year-round paying job with benefits. I was 31, I think. And it was like the greatest moment of my professional life. It is the greatest moment of my professional
Wow.
life.
And
a real job in opera, like a real job. It was awesome.
Was Ed Korn the general director at that time?
Ed was not yet hired. They did a search. This was in the spring of '82, and Ed came in the fall of '82. Okay. And then Ed Korn, who had come from, he'd been at the Opera Company of Philadelphia and Metropolitan Opera.
You've been at the NEA, I think, between Philadelphia and Minnesota.
Yes, right. And Ed, a wonderful guy, but kind of a volatile personality, came in. But he actually, I really didn't have a lot of understanding and perspective of the national opera scene. And he did really two wonderful things. First of all, he had me attend Opera America conferences. And so somewhere around 83, 84, I attended my first conference. And he also then, in about 85 or so, suggested to Patrick Smith, who ran the opera program at the National Endowment for the Arts, Opera Music Theater program, that I be considered as a panelist. And so I was chosen as a panelist for the program and went out and did the panel. This was probably 1986. And an interesting thing happened, and that is that when it came time for Opera America's proposal to be reviewed, whoever was associated with it, in this case, Plato Carianis, who was on the board, had to leave the room. And then the rest of us deliberated about the Opera America proposal. Ultimately, that led to Artis Krennic about a year or so later becoming the chair of the board. At that point, I think was the president, and deciding, yes, we really should make a staffing change at the top. And that's when Marc Scorca was brought in. I remember I was asked to attend a meeting with artists in Chicago, backstage, and I showed up, and she and David Gockley were there. David was the past president, past chair, and the point was to talk about, well, we're now in the recruiting process to get the next executive director, president of Opera America, and I was kind of amazed and kind of flattered that I was even there. But Artis Krennic says, "We've got our person. It's Marc Scorca. He's going to be perfect." And wow, I know Marc, you know. I don't know if it's good enough for Artis, it's good enough for me. And as it turns out, see, many years later, she was, as always, she was right.
Phil, thank you for that. But, and I've tried to get people who knew Artis to share with us just some of the extraordinary qualities of her. And of course, when you were on the board in those early years, as Martin Feinstein and Plato, of course, Peter Hemmings, Artis Krennic, Bob Hewer, David D. Cara. I mean, some of the folks who really shaped American opera in the 70s and 80s. So, what was Artis like?
Well, Artis, it's interesting. When I think of that group, if you didn't know them and you just saw them publicly, or, in a public sense, and I include that as being in a meeting, an Opera America board meeting, let's say, there was a sense of regalism, or regal sense, I should say, and there was a sense of power and authority and kind of old school power politics. And a little rough on the edges sometimes. Martin would, I care about butts in seats, and you'd complain about the unions and the singer contracts and everything. But, you didn't really get into all the nuances of the art and all of that sort of stuff. It was good old fashioned stuff. But in each of those cases, I had the opportunity to sit down more privately with them and talk to them and get to know them a little bit. And they were such warm, wonderful, caring people. And that really, to me, is the driver. Artis Krennic was just a fabulous person. She came off as just this, this great power of leadership. And right below that surface, she was so vulnerable. She talked about how she prayed every morning before she went to work to get her through the day. And you would never think that. She seemed absolutely invincible. Yeah. And that was true. The vulnerability of everybody. And they're talking about their families. And it was really a terrific group of people.
It was. They were such
I'm sorry, what?
And they were such characters. And I was going to remember, we don't need to go into the details of it here, but years and years ago, I did a good impression of Artis, and you once asked me to do it in front of her, and I will never forgive you for that, just so you remember.
That's right. And you did. I won't ask you to do it again. I know you could, but you did a perfect impression, and she thought it was absolutely hilarious. She just laughed and laughed.
Exactly. No, you're absolutely right, because Peter Hemmings and his 5 children, and Martin and his children and grandchildren, I mean, they were these incredible human beings underneath all the bluster of being general directors of opera company.
Sure.
So, you mentioned it, and I wanted to pursue it a little bit. When you became the head of the board, as chair of the board, one of the real priorities that you set was to help the Europeans. And yes, it seems counterlogical that the Americans were helping the Europeans organize around opera, but every country had its own little kind of service organization. And it was a goal to create something that was European, a kind of European parallel to Opera America. And this was a real priority of yours. And I'm curious on reflection now, your observations about how similar, how different the Europeans were, some of the unexpected barriers to helping create Opera Europa as we know it today.
Well, the the term for the board chairpersonship is 2 years, and I ended up serving 2 terms, which was fairly standard. And I wanted to set some sort of goal, and there was a strategic plan, and for my first 2-year term, and you and I discussed it, and I thought about it with the board. And so at this point, there was a real energy in Europe and among us from Opera America to really try to build something like a sister organization in Europe, something comparable to Opera America. The European Union was coming into play now. The idea of Europe-wide collaboration, interaction was becoming a sensibility that they were interested in. There was funding to be had for this sort of thing, which is a key issue here. And we may want to go back to that later, because I think that ended up being a key issue for the development of Opera America in a variety of ways too. We'll talk about that later. But it was a great opportunity to, as you and I both know, because we spent a lot of time on the road in Europe, talking to people, having meetings, and of course everybody wanted to party and have a good time and host well and talk. But when it really came down to what was the functional relationship and the collaboration, it was really hard to do, because they just weren't really used to thinking in that way and working in that way. And there was a key moment when finally what we arranged is that Opera America would provide services for this new fledgling Opera Europa organization and pay Opera America a certain amount of money, and you and the staff of Opera America would service them as you service Opera America. And they were a little uncomfortable with the arrangement. And the biggest reason is that it was just like early Opera America, that they really didn't want to delegate so much to a paid staff and paid executive. They really wanted, their tradition was, their sensibility was to really be able to do it all themselves and just have somebody, kind of organize for things. And I remember at a meeting in, I think it was Copenhagen, and I think we asked you to leave the room, and I just had a conversation with him and said, look, this is the way it works in the United States. This is the way we organize. This is the way Opera America is organized. If you don't like that, then you don't have to do it. But this isn't, there's a culture clash here. And if you just want to be a group and just have a secretary doing some thing for you, great. But otherwise, if you want to become a full-fledged service organization, do all these things, you have to have a full-fledged staff, and they have to behave accordingly. And they kind of sit around and said, okay, yeah. So anyway, so they decided they would roll with it and keep going, and then that blossomed, and ultimately they got leadership, and they have done nicely by themselves.
Really well.
My point about Opera America and collaborations in general is that one of the early on in Opera America in the 80s, one of the biggest changes and most controversial changes in Opera America was creating a regranting program. It was very contentious, not very contentious, but it was there was a lot of controversy within the organization, within the board about this, in part because the idea of Opera America giving out grants to member organizations could potentially create a political rat's nest, a nightmare. And how could that be done fairly so that all of the members, whether they applied or not, would feel that this was fair, valuable function for Opera America to serve. And of course, Opera in the 80s beyond, developing new works, encouraging these sorts of things, Opera America obtaining funding that really wasn't being taken away or redirected from individual opera companies. All of a sudden, that transformed Opera America and its relationship with its members into a real interactive business relationship whereby the members not only were paying dues and getting information and services, they were actually getting, in many cases, they were getting more money from Opera America than they were giving, or there was a back and forth. It's like, okay, well, I pay my federal taxes, but then the federal government provides all this funding for this and that and the other thing, and that ended up being the basis of building an Opera America, the Opera America we know today. And the other thing was, of course, that it used to be early on that it was a top-down sensibility, not only, well, within the culture of Opera America. So the board members, the general directors, would be communicated with, and it was their responsibility to tell their staffs what they knew, what they heard, what Opera America could provide, statistics, information, whatever. Well, of course, under your leadership and around that time in the 80s into the 90s, we transformed, or Opera America was transformed, so that it began to directly serve staff members of the various disciplines. I mean, earlier, from the beginning, there was an education staff member and education component. But now we started doing production and marketing and fundraising and management in general. And Opera America became a full service organization for the full service, all of the services an opera company provides, and on a professional basis. And then, of course, then it expanded from there to not just be an organization of professionals, but of volunteers, of philanthropists. And so there really has been this growth in the definition of what a service organization was. And right along that path, Opera Europa came into being. And I think in a lot of ways, probably not, I haven't tracked it closely these last years, but I think well, I know they absolutely benefited from this process that we, the Americans, annoyingly to them, had initiated and cultivated within their ranks.
Yeah, and Opera Europa is doing so well these days. It really is a pleasure to have such a robust partner organization. And I'm going to connect two dots here, because you said earlier when you were solving the curtain call problem back at Glimmerglass, that it wasn't about you, it was about just solving the problem. And isn't that a key to collaboration? Because I know in your time as general director at Minnesota Opera, you started the arts partnership at the Ordway Center, where all of the users of the Ordway got together to really optimize the fundraising, the design and functionality of the Performing Arts Center. So partnerships have meant a lot to you. Opera Europa, the arts partnership, and clearly you see value.
A lot of co-production work.
Yeah, that's true. So absolutely. You see the reward at the other end of the challenges of partnership.
Well, first of all, they don't always work. And the difference between them working mostly and not working is whether or not there really is a shared value in it. Is there, in this sense, a business interest? Let's just say, to keep it basic. We had tried for 15 years at the Ordway to create various types of relationship structures, partnerships. Nothing ever fell into place. And at one point, one of the board members of the Ordway, a guy named Carl Drake, who ran Travelers, now it was St. Paul Companies, now Travelers, said, we'll never have a viable collaboration unless we have mutual business interests. And so what happened with the arts partnership is where you have a performing arts center and you have resident organizations, St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, Super Club Minnesota Opera, using them, and all sorts of conflicts having to do with logistics and money, marketing and fundraising overlaps. These are absolutely common in this world. And what we did is found a way that we could mutually understand and agree and create strategies around not just efficiencies of working together, but actually growing our organizations on a collective basis. So what happened in this case is this organization came into being. I think it has raised probably $85–90 million since it was founded in the late 90s, I guess, and created expanded the campus of the Ordway into not just a multi-use opera house, but 1,800 seats, but also took a smaller space and recast it, rebuilt it, redesigned it as an 1,100 seat concert hall with St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, thus now having a specific music space and a specific opera space, and then that and an endowment to support all these things, sharing the cost of maintaining these things, working out all the details, and it has been a terrific success. I've been involved with a number of different situations that are very comparable to that have never panned out, where there hasn't been a collaboration achieved, because usually it's just too much territorialism, too much, there aren't the tangible benefits that everyone needs to really see it and make it work. Mm-hmm. And most recently, I was involved in one in Wyoming, just tangentially as a consultant, and in Jackson Hole and Performing Arts Center, and they have all kinds of issues around the same sorts of issues we had. They can't resolve anything because really it's just people stuff, and they haven't really found the common ground to do that. So once again, Opera America has been able to thrive on the basis of finding value in relationships and collaborations among opera companies, between opera companies, facilitating this between Opera America and not only the companies, but the broader world and community. And Opera Europa has been able to do the same thing. And it hasn't been just a matter of getting European Union money. They really have been able to, individually as companies and entities, they've been able to benefit and see the benefit of the collaboration. But if that benefit isn't perceived by all the participants, it's either not going to happen or it's not going to hold up.
Does that same concept of perceived benefit, the business interest as you describe it, does that pertain to co-production among companies as well?
Oh, absolutely. And that, yeah, so we did, in Minnesota, we did a lot of co-production, in part because we had a scene shop, we had a costume shop, and we didn't have a lot of money. And we needed to do things. We needed partnerships. We needed people to invest in new productions. And a lot of opera companies, regional opera companies, don't have shops. And those that do, of course, they have the same interests and desires. So in order to make all of that work, we sort of changed up, I guess I sort of changed the rules a little bit to what was typically done, and just said, look, you can, if you were going to spend $50,000 or $30,000, you opera company A, to rent a production, you can buy a share in our production, which is going to cost $300,000. You can put $50,000 in. You will be a percentage ownership of that. Once we pay off the initial costs, you will share in the rental revenue of that. And if it goes over budget, we'll take responsibility because we're the lead producer. If it goes under budget, then we all share in that. So we took on the risk, we took on the reward, and a classic example of success in that was the Turandot that we did in 2001, I think. And I think there were 8 companies, and we had 50,000 in, and I think we all made a goodly amount of money because that production was used and reused by the 8 companies and rented. And so once again, it was a matter of finding the mutual benefit that will work for different partners in different situations. So it doesn't mean that everybody has to be absolutely equal, but everyone has to have a strategic and usually a financial advantage to make these things work. In this case, it's business.
Yeah, yeah. It's just wonderfully expressed. So I want to explore a couple of chapters in your various retirements because you're the man who just couldn't retire. So you retired from the Minnesota Opera, and after a short interval, you became president of the Minnesota Orchestra. And you did that after, I think it was a 16-month labor dispute. It was very prolonged and very bitter. And you were seen as someone who could come in and bring the parties together again. So I want to hear a little bit about that experience, and then just your observations about how different or similar an orchestra is from an opera company.
Well, first of all, I think everyone who's been around various performing disciplines realizes that there's sort of a specific culture associated with each discipline. You know, the dancers, ballet companies have a culture, and theaters do, and opera companies do, and orchestras do. And so there's that, and it's true. Now, opera companies have orchestras, and so you're familiar with an orchestra. But when you have, 70, 80 musicians that basically are there year round and with you, along with 70 or 80 board members and 70, 80 staff members, there are two things going on here. After you've run a regional opera company, which really has, in our case, had about 30 or 40 full-time year-round employees, everyone else, production, artistic, everything was jobbed in on a per service weekly basis or whatever. All of a sudden, the entire structure and everyone artistically, administratively, is one big family, and families are as wonderful and dysfunctional as we all know them to be. And so really the interesting thing for me running between Minnesota Opera and Minnesota Orchestra, first of all, I went from a $10 million organization to a $30 million organization, quite a bit bigger one. There was a lot more volume of activity. I mean, we're doing concerts, just coming at you every week. And it was very challenging, and it was a very dysfunctional situation. So it was a turnaround. I love turnarounds, and this was a turnaround situation. And just like with any organization, when I was consulting with Opera America, whatever problems and issues they are, really, it generally comes down to the relationship between people. If you have a functional community, board, staff, community, audience, artists, whatever, that is really functionally work together, then you're basically a success. If you don't, bad things happen. When I joined Minnesota Opera, the company was just completely out of sync. They didn't like each other, they didn't agree artistically, and ultimately what tends to happen is you can quantify the dysfunction financially, and there are financial problems. We had financial problems, we were insolvent, okay, start over again. The problem with the Minnesota Orchestra and with many of these organizations is that they don't communicate, they don't talk. Sometimes, in this case, in the Minnesota Orchestra, it was by design. They had decided that management and the board weren't going to talk to musicians. So how do you put that back together? Well, it's the same thing as an opera company, and I know I'm going on a little too much about this, but it was the thing about running an orchestra to me was two things. First of all, you had so many more voices to accommodate a large organization and more people there and involved. And then the other thing was that, and this is just a personal thing, I've been doing opera for decades, and you do a lot of the same rep over and over again. And all of a sudden, it's not like I didn't know any orchestra rep, but there's every concert, there was some stuff that I was discovering, and the nuances among the musicians and how those relationships work when they're in they might hate each other, but the way they work together day in and day out was just a profound experience from an artistic point of view. Yeah. So bottom line is that I think that it would have been a fairly straightforward transition if I were running like a Chicago or a San Francisco, running a big company with established year-round orchestra, chorus, all those sorts of things. But the way a regional opera company is designed, it was really a huge learning curve for me to step into that situation.
And in another sequential parallel retirement for you was you're consulting with a lot of opera companies, half a dozen, 8 opera companies. And I think almost every one of them was a turnaround situation where there was either a leadership transition or financial upheaval, and frequently the two go together. That someone leaves, the financial problems become apparent, and you've got to solve it. You said you enjoy turnaround situations. Why? What about them?
Well, first of all, it's exciting. It's Minnesota Opera. When I was at Minnesota, I ran it for 25 years, and for at least the first 10 or 15, I considered it a turnaround. It was a slow turnaround, and that's really was my first experience with that sort of thing. It's very dynamic, very dramatic, as with the Minnesota Orchestra in particular. All of a sudden, you can take risks and do things and say things that nobody would ever dream of allowing you to do. So there is a license to be dynamic that you can't do if everything is kind of tried and true and running. And I like that. There's a lot of pressure in its own way, but you love it or you don't, and I do. When I was consulting with Opera America, which was great, it was 3 years of just wonderful work and experience,
of the most difficult assignments we could throw you.
Yeah, but also then being able to share them with the field, which I did, and that was part of our deal. This was something that came out of Opera America's strategic plan, to have field consultants out there working, so that you could spend extended periods of time working on difficult situations. And typically when you go into these situations, if I had to say that there was one specific weakness of an organization that was in trouble, it was the board. And boards don't have to do a lot to be functional. I mean, they have to do their job, do their fiscal, their custodial responsibilities, hire good staff, and support the organization and do these things. But if they don't hire the right staff, if they don't have the right leadership, these are volunteer boards. And the dynamics of those, the culture, the history of them is such that it's really difficult for them to make change and maneuver. And when they get into a hole, it's really often very hard for a board to get out of it. And that's really what was one of the rewarding things that, in this case, we, Opera America, could provide to these organizations. The staff, in most every case, was either gone or going, the leadership, because that's, and that's what you get for having a failed organization. They don't bring in a consultant unless they're in really bad shape. Right. Really bad shape. And at that point, then you are largely working with the board. And I love that. Board members, these are community members that, they're doing this because they love it and they really care. And I just have profound respect for that, even when they are at their most dysfunctional. And sometimes I got into some real, battles with some of these board members, not personal, but just about the organization and why we do what we do. We did a lot of governance work, which I think was absolutely and remains absolutely key. So it was really a wonderfully rewarding experience for me. And I think in at least a couple of these cases, we got some opera companies out of very hot water, and they're still up and running.
No, I think you saved several. There's several that would have closed without your intervention. And I wish we had someone else like you, because a number of retired general directors would like some assignments, but can they be assignments where there isn't a crisis, where we don't have to worry about raising money for payroll, where the staff is strong and stable? It's like, those companies don't hire consultants.
Those are the ones that don't need or want a consultant.
Right. It's very funny how that plays out.
Yeah.
You are one of the people, and I watched it, where you had a successful career, long tenure at the Minnesota Opera, and concurrently you raised two beautiful daughters, and you supported the wonderful career of a marvelous wife. You had a balance, Kevin, and a lot of people don't. There are a whole lot of folks in our industry who don't have families, whose family really is the opera company. Uh, and when they say they say I do to a company, not to another individual. What are some of your insights about having a responsible family life and being a responsible general director?
Was it Beverly Sills that said that running an opera company is for what, orphans and widows or something like that?
Yeah, and the orphans and one of the right, you should not have any parents and should not have any children. You have to be single and an orphan, I think is what she said.
Something along those lines. And well, first of all, I have spoken even at Opera America training or situations about work-life balance. And I think that so much of your life is work. You spend so much time there that it helps a lot if work is fulfilling. And I've actually never even thought this before, I said this before. If you have a bad job, it's really hard to have a work-life balance. If you have a good job, I think it's much easier because you're happier, you're better adjusted. When you're actually in charge of something, then yes, you have the responsibility and the pressure and all of that, but you also have the flexibility. So my wife and I were both working full-time. We had 2 kids, we had no family within 2,000 miles of us. And we sort of supported each other. When one kid was sick, we kind of arranged that one of us would cover and they couldn't get into daycare, and do all those sorts of things. And so we made it work. Watching my older daughter, she has a 3 and a 5-year-old and a husband. She and her husband both work and have very challenging jobs. Boy, if they didn't have us around, I don't know what they would do. Well, I do know what they would do. They would do what we did. You just make it work. And I have said, and I really truly believe it to be the case, that if I were more dedicated, if I spent more time at the opera, we could have gotten a little bit more out of the opera company. I could have than I did. I didn't. I think the opera company did well. And I think that having that kind of relationship that I can have a satisfactory private life and personal life added to the longevity of my ability to stay longer there than just sort of burn out or do something. But it's really, I don't know. I don't know how you do it. I do have 2 absolutely wonderful daughters and a wonderful wife, and I had a happy private life and a happy professional life, and just I'm vaccinated. I'm, glad to be around.
It gets back to your ability to solve the problem of the 2 sopranos and their curtain calls.
Yeah.
But I remember I've quoted you pretty accurately about the fact that, if you had chosen differently, maybe the Minnesota Opera endowment would be bigger by a few $1 million, but that few $1 million wasn't worth neglecting your children or your wife. Right. And that if you had to make hard choices, for the most part, your hard choices were in favor of your family.
That's true. That's true.
I think great lesson.
I'm trying to think of times when, once again, my wife, Lynn, is a wonderful person, and we covered for each other. If I was really hunkered down, then she would cover. As you know, when we were doing the opera at Europa work, I happened on a 3-month sabbatical in Italy, in Florence, to study opera and study how, but we couldn't figure out how the Italians function because we couldn't get them to collaborate. They were just wonderful to be around, but we just couldn't, so how do they actually produce? How do they think about opera? And so during most of that time, I was by myself in Florence, and my wife was, raising 2 kids and working full time and doing all that stuff herself. And she just took that on. And, in some cases, maybe that wouldn't have been possible, but I had a lot of support.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Now, I'm sure that young people seek you out for advice about a career as an arts administrator, as an arts leader. Are there a couple of key points of advice that everyone hears from you?
Well, first of all, people don't, they used to seek me out. I'm kind of past tense now, which is fine. I mean, which is great. If somebody wanted to seek me out and ask me a question, I probably don't have a lot new to say, but at this point, I have had a lot of time to think about it, and I haven't come up with anything new. And what I would basically say to people who do an informational interview, want to get involved in the arts, is just get your foot in the door. Do it. If you need to be they don't even have them anymore, receptionist or an administrative assistant, whatever you want to do, if you are good and smart and caring and you've got the qualities in a nonprofit situation, you have talent and drive, you're going to get noticed and you're going to learn, and people around you will notice, and you can and will move up. And so, because a lot of people are saying, well, should I go and get an MBA? How do I do it? It's the Charlie Tuna thing. I mean, they want tuna that tastes good, not that, has good taste. In other words, if you look good on paper, it's great, but really you have to prove yourself professionally. And so I always just say, get out there, take some risks, put yourself in professional situations, and see how it goes. And once again, if you've got it, you're going to get noticed.
Kevin, it's so great to talk to you. And the memories of our work together just flood into my brain. And there's so many more stories we could laugh about. I'm really grateful for your taking this time today to document a little bit of your experience and your wisdom. So thank you for being a part of our 50th anniversary and a part of our lives for all of these years. And I'll just look forward to being in touch with you and to seeing you and Lynn very soon.
Well, thank you, Mark, and congratulations to you. You've built, what I really felt was probably the weakest of the various service organizations among disciplines in the United States into by far the most successful, dynamic organization. And I just don't know. I think that without Opera America, I think the opera field in America would be much less. You guys have really become just a leading light and not only inspiration, but provided resources and inspiration to really get through extraordinarily tough times as an industry. So congratulations to you.
Well, thank you.
And the board.